welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely stunningly beautiful novel. It's a debut novel, and this book is so many things. It is poetry, it is memoir, it is remembrance, it is fiction, and it is a tribute to a mother. So many things that I am very excited to discuss. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jen. My name is Sam Sussman, and I'm the author of Boy from the North Country, which is coming out in a few days.
Congratulations on your eminent publication. As I was saying, it is an absolutely gorgeous book. And I'd love if we could start by talking about the origins of the book. You published an article in Harper's in 2021. So could you perhaps talk about the journey from that article to this novel?
I published an article called The Silent Type on possibly being Bob Dylan's son. And this is the story. I grew up with my mother in the Hudson Valley. From a young age, people would point out to me that I looked like Dylan. I eventually learned that my mother had had a romantic relationship with him, and that raised all sorts of questions. And the emotional journey that I write about is toward moving past the question of whether I have a biological connection to him and growing into an appreciation for the person who made me who I am. And that's my mother. So my favorite description of the essay, someone said it was a love letter from a son to his mother. And many people have asked me, well, why didn't you just write a memoir? Why write a novel? Well, the first answer to that is I'm a novelist, and just like a painter or a photographer makes sense of her life experiences by painting or photography, I make sense of my life experience by writing. But there was a deeper reason, and that's the heart of this novel for me is trying to convey that the heart of this novel for me is toward leading the reader to a place where they feel that there's something larger in life than the question of a biological connection to a celebrity. And that's a difficult road to lead a reader down in our culture where there's so much fixation with fame and celebrity, but it's something that I feel very deeply. And the novel works perfectly as a form because by its nature, the novel tells you it could be true, it could not. It denies facticity. And the story I'm trying to tell is one in which that fact is ultimately not the most important part of the story. The love and memory and emotion between mother and the son is what I wanted to carry this book.
In a recent New York Times profile, you quoted Samuel Beckett and you said that you have to find the form that fits the mess in reference to writing it as fiction. And I'm curious if the process of writing autofiction, of turning your experiences and memories into fiction, does it transform your emotions about your memories? Does it give you new insights into your past? How does the act of writing sort of affect your relationship to the material?
That's such a wonderful question. My mother used to say there are two stories of every life. What I think she meant by that is that when we tell the story of who we are, that story becomes in part who we are. That there are so many different ways we can understand our own experiences, all of them true. And when someone asks you how your day is, if you say it was horrible, and then you talk about the 12 things that went wrong, and you have an unpleasant 45 minutes talking about that, that becomes part of your day. If you say it was majestic, here are the six things that made me happy, and you spend 45 minutes talking about what made you happy that day, that becomes part of your day. And I think the same thing is true in writing about your life. And there were many, many ways I could have used the material of my life in a novel. But the story that I ultimately chose to tell, and the story by which I ultimately choose to understand who I am and what I value in myself, is a mother-son love story. And in a way, writing it writing it was a way for me reminding myself who I am and what I value in myself and who I want to be.
That's lovely. And as a child of divorce, there was so much here that resonated with me because I think when you're growing up, you spend a lot of time focusing on the parent who wasn't there, right? And I feel like oftentimes later in your life, you come back to the parent that was, and you can sort of appreciate them in a new light. And so that sort of reappreciation of a person who was so constant that you I don't want to say fail to appreciate them, but become part of your routine of your everyday, getting to appreciate them in a different context and with new experience and wisdom and all that is really powerful, I think.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I've had so many people say that to me, certainly after my Harper's memoir essay came out. And I think that there's a linked experience there, which is also the experience of getting to know your parent as an adult. And so many of us, our foundational relationship to our parents, of course, it's rooted in childhood, it's rooted in our needs. And especially when we have giving or selfless parents, my mother was giving and selfless in many ways. It takes time for you to start asking the questions. Wait, tell me this about your life. And so much of the experience of our relationship in my 20s and so much of what I wanted to write about was coming into an adult understanding of who my mother was in all of her complexities. What were the events that made her who she was, the choices and the values. And part of this novel is a recreation of her youth in this bohemian New York Manhattan arts world in the 1970s. And writing those parts of her life made me feel closer to her and made me feel that I understood certain things about her more deeply. And I'm still on a quest to understand her more deeply. And I think that's a very universal experience.
The scenes told from her perspective that are set in the 70s in the village are so evocative, both of her experience of that place at that time and in terms of the East Village as like a site of cultural alchemy, if you want to call it, just where things were happening. Was there any research that you did to bring that period of time alive? Apart from the many conversations that you had with your mother about that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in New York 5 years now, and part of my experience of the city has been asking people who are older than me about the different New Yorks that they have known. That's something I take great pleasure in doing, and I'm lucky to have many, many friends who are decades older than me. And I happen to live in the apartment that my mother lived in, old rent stabilized apartment in New York in the 1970s, in the period that I'm writing about and she was living through. And this neighborhood of New York, Yorkville, has it's known as a sort of theater community. It has the highest density of rent stabilized apartments anywhere in New York. And I've gotten to know a few people in this neighborhood who even moved here around the same time that my mother did, and they've spent their whole lives in this neighborhood in rent stabilized apartments that have sort of made their New York possible. And so speaking to some of those people about their experience of that time period was exhilarating for me, but I have to give credit where it's due and say that most of my recreation of that period is drawn from conversations with my mom.
Some of that relationship is explored in the novel. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about Evan and June. This question isn't meant to sort of find out what is true, what is not, but rather more about an approach to writing and to fiction. But where do you personally draw the line between what is true in the sense of things that happened in space-time and true in the sense of the emotional truth, where you might get actually like a little bit creative with the facts and the events and the dates, perhaps? Do you have a way that you approach that, or is it sort of like a case by case basis as you're writing?
Well, Evan, the character, that's my middle name. And
Mm.
that felt appropriate to me. My mother's middle name was Juna with a D after Juna Barnes, and I call her character June. And that felt right to me that those characters are part of us, but they're not all of us. And you can't put all of a person into a book. And so much of what fiction is, especially when you're writing from your life, is what you choose to excerpt. This novel is an excerpt of my life. There are many experiences in my life that I don't have the time or space to write about. And so I think we tend to think about fiction and nonfiction in terms of truth or invention. And I think that that's limiting in certain ways. And I think about it more in terms of the parts of ourselves that we're choosing to give to a story because there's too much of us to give all of our lives. I mean, even if you're Marcel Proust or Knausgaard or something like that, you can't give all of yourself to a character. And I think ultimately in any story, even a memoir that claims to be giving every factually accurate detail, what we're really reading for is an emotional or spiritual truth. Picasso has that great line where he says, art is a lie that tells us the truth. Art can also be a truth that tells us the truth.
I do really like that. And I think your point about, there being many different New York cities, there are many different Jens, there are many different Sams, there are different people every time that we interact with a new person. And we also contain many stories. And so I think that's also a very interesting part of autofiction is that you are finding an arc in a thing, in a life, which while we are living it, it doesn't have an end, right? Like we ourselves don't have access to the meaning, if that makes sense. But it's that search for, I guess, for the arc or for the narrative in there. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that every writer is in the act of writing, choosing what to value in him or herself. And I don't think that's particular to writing. It's happening maybe in slightly more subtle forms. In every artistic medium, a actress, a painter, is a musician is choosing which of their emotions they're going to give to us and to their work. And that's part of why we turn to art and why it matters in our lives. And so much of this book is also about the realizations that and the self-knowledge that art can give to us. And, the character based on my mother comes to profound realizations about who she is by playing Hedda Gabler on stage, by painting in Norman Rabin's art studio. And she decides to take those realizations and rather than continue in a life in the arts, she realizes that she wants something larger and different, and that she's not going to find the parts of herself that she's searching for as an actress or a painter. But I mean, in my mother's life, I think she lived deeply by the self-knowledge and realizations that she came to as an artist in her 20s.
There's so much in her story about art and love and how I think how they can shape our relationships and how we approach them. Something that I found super interesting in June's relationship with Dylan is this idea that you can be so good at capturing the feeling of love on the page or in the song, but yet not be very good at loving or not knowing how to do the verb of loving, you know? Can you talk a little bit about that idea and just sort of like the role that art plays like in the emotional arc of the story too?
Well, my mother and Dylan in the book and in life had different relationships between art and life. And their painting instructor, Norman Rabin, had a slogan, art as a way of life. And Dylan would quote that. And in the chapters that you were describing, my mother's character is playing Hedda Gabler and Dylan is working on Blood on the Tracks. When my mother met Dylan in the year that he was struggling through personal and artistic crisis and putting so much of that pain and creativity into Blood on the Tracks. And she comes to a moment after his recorded Blood, and she's had this stupendous performance as Hedda, where she realizes that her hope was after these two great artistic struggles, they would have this quiet time together, more time for one another. And she realizes he's just on to the next song, the next album. When he says art as a way of life, he means that. And she said to me once he could more easily give me love songs than love. There's a moment in the book where he calls her, he would often call her when he was on the road to play songs that he was working on. And he calls her and he starts playing the song Sarah, which is this anguished love ballad written for his wife at the end of their relationship. And he says to her, what do you think? As if it's just music and there's nothing emotional here and there's nothing strange about calling the woman that you're having an affair with to play a love song about your wife. And I think it was experiences like that that left my mother feeling that for him there would be nothing larger than his own art. And for her, she was going through difficult experiences at that point of her life that made her realize what she needed deeply was love.
It's a beautiful journey for June and for Evan or for you. And it is such a pleasure to read and really full of emotional insight and vulnerability, which is just really, really beautiful and very moving. I'm really curious about what you have on your horizon. Are you writing? Well, I know you're probably deep in book promotion right now, but are you writing anything at the moment?
I am. I'm working on a second novel. When I finished this novel, I made the last edit one afternoon in the Hudson Valley, the house where I grew up, where I still live. And I closed the laptop and I walked in the woods behind the house where I walked for many, many years with my mother. And I was feeling, what am I going to write now that is larger than the experiences that I've tried to put into this book? And, I've written about the most formative relationship I had, written about the most formative experience of being with my mother at the end of her life, questions of identity and paternity. And I realized that to me, the outstanding question, what is larger than what I've written about, what I think my mother would say, is love. And so I'm writing a novel now that is about how people experience freedom in love and artistic life in different ways and how they reconcile those different ambitions within their lives and relationships.
Mm. I'm very eagerly awaiting that one. Godspeed, happy writing. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and with our patrons. I'm so excited to recommend this book to everybody at our library.
Thank you, Jen. I really appreciate you having me on.
You're very welcome. Okay, listeners, now it's your turn. Please check out Boy from the North Country. Absolutely beautiful read. We're heading into the holiday gift giving season, and I think it is a beautiful gift for the reader in your life. So please head to your favorite bookstore, library website, wherever you like to go for books. Do you have a favorite bookstore or a place you like to send people for books?
I have a list of bookshops, indie shops on my website, samevansussman.org, and there's one in almost every major American city, and these are indie shops that I've partnered with so that we can all skirt around the big corporations and put money into the hands of locally owned indie bookshops.
Wow, love to hear that. So I'll drop that link in our show notes so that people can go right to it. All right, it is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.